Assalamu alaikum, brothers and sisters. So this will be my first video on the history, politics and movements of the Al-Andalusicans. I'm going to be reading some quotations from a rather knowledgeable book which I mentioned, the Muslim Spain and Portugal. I've got it here online, and I'm going to give you my own interpretations as they go around from it. So the Iberian Peninsula, divided into the great provinces of Tarraconensis, Carthaginius, Bactrius, Lustius and Galicia, had been one of the richest and most developed areas of Western Roman Empire. Now, this is predating Islamic encounter, so we're talking around about between 200 to 300 BC. So this time period is when the Romans were slowly decreasing, but the Iberian Peninsula itself was still quite rich. But for 3 centuries before the coming of the Muslims, it had been dominated by warrior aristocrats of the Germans' origins. Most successful of these were the Visigoths, who first entered the peninsula in the early 5th century. Now, this is entirely true. Now, one of the things that was historically mentioned to me when I was studying history was that the southern Visigoths were not as Christianized as everyone thinks they were. There are several letters going backwards and forwards by the Pope involving and acknowledging the fact that the Christianization of the southern Visigoths had generally failed, and that they were still maintaining much of their cultural inappropriate behaviour, one of them being cannibalism. Now, it is assumed that because the journey at the time, using the boats that they were using, the Moors, or the Maghrebans, who were coming north, being led by their great future king and general, invaded because of the raids coming from the southern Visigothians to the what would be modern day Moroccans for cannibalistic reasons. Now, of course, these are only rumouristical points of view. There were no actual physical proof, because at the time periods, if there were raids that went on with it, when the Al-Andalusicans wiped out the southern Visigoths, we're not talking slightly wiped them out, they fucking annihilated them in terms of their culture, art and then adaptations. With the ancestors of King Legovius in 565, the Visigoth monarch entered into the century and a half of stability, during which the kings based in Toledo exerted effective power. Now, Toledo's more middle Spain. It's not the southern Visigoths, as I was just mentioning to you. The kingdom shared many of its characteristics of the post-Roman kingdoms in France and Italy. In general, the Visigoth monarchy was reasonably strong and effective instruments of government. It did not suffer the internal divisions and progressive deliberations of contemporary Moravian monarchy in France, and right up until the Muslim invasion, the king maintained the control over most of the Iberian Peninsula. This is not entirely true. The southern Visigoth clans and tribes tended to disagree with their king on a regular basis. In fact, there were more than 1 or 2 punch-ups involving them, but the evidence towards it is suspectively held to being unintensive. But from what we know, historically speaking, there were disagreements between the Al-Andalusican invasion, well, the southern Visigothians and their king, though the disagreements were more the same ways that nobles squabbled amongst themselves. In theory, the monarchy was elected, and successive church councils of Toledo in the midst of the 11th century had laid down the rules of the king would be elected by the bishops and nobles. Now, this is actually fanciful. Basically, he's doing a little bit of revisionism here. The simple basic is the bishops chose the kings. If you weren't part of the Toledo royal family elites and you weren't Christian enough, you wouldn't get elected as king, because it was an elected monarchy. The nobles tended to follow the footprints of what the bishops previously say. Where are we? To the Catholic Christian, a Goth by descent and free of birth. He would be elected either in Toledo or in the site of the previous king's death, and before his ascension he had sworn to uphold the laws of the realm and practiced. The choice of monarchies was confirmed to the most important lineages, and there by nature tendency from father to wish to pass their own crown to their sons. Now, again, it was also involving the briberation of bishops. Now, this was normal in the Catholic faith. If you wanted your son elected in an elected monarchy, which the church perpetrated in the first 500 to 600 years, you had to make sure that the church pockets were lined. So you had to have your own bishops, you had to have your own financial capacities. And this was the Christian monarchy across the entire breadth during the first 500 years of Catholicism. And that's after the first 500 years, where from 0 to 500 was when Christianity was all one people. But after the Pope and the Metropolitan excommunicated each other, that's when the first 500 years of Catholicism, royal monarchies were very much decentralised. Their power was kept in check by bishops, by land-hungry nobles. The king himself had very little actual physical power during these early time periods. Under the king, chief men of the state were the nobles, mostly of Goth origins, and bishops, mostly recently from the Hispanic Roman landowners class. Although the distinction between the two groups must have largely disappeared by the beginning of the 8th century. Besides proving spiritual leadership, the bishops were also among the largest landowners. This was normal. This was normal, as I said. One of the key reasons why the Metropolitan of Constantinople disagreed with the Pope is because the Pope had so many landowning bishops. This was completely and utterly normal. Them owning this much property, land, materialistical capacity was absolutely normal. The bishops were also, past that, who sometimes bore the title of duax or dukes or commats or counts, were also owners of large, often unexplored estates cultivated by semi-free peasants. It was the nobles too who provided the army. Apart from the royal guard, there was no standing army, and the nobles brought their followers in response to royal summons. Yes and no. Each individual estate at its time period had individual established fiefdoms, so they had their own retainers. So their retainers at this time period could fluctuate between 10 retainers, depending on how rich the noble was, up to having 500 retainers if you were one of the powerful dukes of Iberia. So yes and no. There wasn't a standing army, but there were feudalistical armies that would then join the various noble armies of the king, and those armies themselves were unprofessional. In general, this simplistic military system to have functioned fairly successful, but it probably meant that the bulk of the troops owned their first lord to their lords rather than to their monarchies. As I was saying, fiefdom nobility meant that the lord would draw his money from his various fiefs and the various people he subletted to, farms, Freemasons. Now, that's not the culture group of Freemasons. I'm talking about actual Masons who owned their own tools and equipment and were basically capable of running their own towns. Townships and such like, and then from that money he would then maintain his own retainers. Every retainer was given a salary, and every retainer was loyal first to his lord and then in theory to the king of Iberia, which was the Toledan royal family. It is important to make any precise assessment of the population and economy of the peninsula. It has been plausibly suggested that the population had been around about 6 million in the early Roman period, but had been reduced by plague and war for 4 million later Visigothic period. Yeah, you see, now I would be that's being optimistic. From what I was told and historically mentioned, most of their population had dipped easily as low as 3 million at that time period. The largest Visigoth period archaeologically evidence shows that these large open cities of the early period had shrunk into small fortified settlements, country estates, and their buildings were essentially more primitive than that of the great landforts and villas of the Imperial Roman period. This is absolutely proven. You know, that much of Visigoth period was about a shrinking from Roman intervention, and this is before the arrival of the Andalusicans themselves. When the Andalusicans did arrive, they arrived with in force, they expanded, they advised people, even the Christians, to have bigger families. They brought North African medicine, vast amounts of it, Persian and North African medicine, much upon the Maghreb invasion was based upon the Umayyad Caliphate. So the Caliphate itself was bringing vast amount of learning sciences, because the Roman period had already collapsed at this point in this side of Europe. So Roman knowledge and Roman medicine, bathhouses, none of this stuff was being maintained. So diseases were kicking back in, so the population started to shrink. When, upon the arrival of the Umayyads, I'm going to get further into this, they brought so much into Iberia, they practically saved it. I mean, much of it was Persian, early Greek. There was a lot of Judaic materials there. Jews came along with the Maghreb, so people didn't realise that. It is impossible to make any precise assessment of the population. I've done that. Let's move on. The Bebians were the real power in the land. They were and still are the indigenous inhabitants of North Africa. No, go north. Under the king, it is impossible to make any precisions of the population. All population had been about 6 million. Country estates got there. 7th century, when the Muslims began to attack, the reigning Byzantine garrison defending their coastal strongholds stubbornly, and they held out much longer than any garrison in Syria or Palestine had done a generation before. But they could easily be bypassed by overland invaders and were only a real threat when allied to the Bebian tribes of the area. Now, basically, the Byzantines used to play everyone off. They would play, the Byzantines were basically the last remnants of the Roman Empire, and they would play the Bebians and the various other tribals, the pagan tribals, against the growth of Islam as it started moving across the continent of Africa. So there was always this double backwind. So basically, the Umayyad would move forward, they would gain vast amount of land, and then they'd have to fall back because the Byzantines would come out of their sea-based fortresses. Remember, at this point, the Mare Nostrum was still very much a Byzantium sea. The Byzantium navy was enormous. They still controlled Anatolia. They were still effectively an aging but world power in the terminology that you would understand today. So they weren't to be fucked with. Much like America's aircraft carriers are today, the Byzantines had vast fleets. So with the Berbers who lived in the cities, many more lived as farmers in the mountain villages. Some were kept sheep and goats in the steppes, had lands, and yet had lands upon yet removing and wandering into the Taurog, due to tonight the remote of the awesomeness waste of the Sahara. Bedouin genealogy and much less fully recorded. The Arabs won, and it is difficult to gauge whether the scattered references we have refer to the statistic relationship or whether some groups were expanding at the expense of others. According to the Arab sources, the Bedouin tribes were divided into two groups called Burta and Baharim, just as the Arab tribes were divided into Qaza and Murdan and Yemen. Most of the Bedouins who joined the Muslim conquest and settled in Andalusia came from the Burta group. They seem to have retained their tribal identities and probably their pagan religions in the 6th century. Their tribes were moved west from Tripoli and Pontegara and pressured on the Byzantine settlements. The Bereans, by contrast, were older established tribes who had entered into the close relationships with the Byzantines, had in many cases converted to Christianity. Now, these Christian Berbers weren't as numerous as the paganistic ones that were in the North Saharans and generally ignored by Christianity. Now, when the Muslims arrived, they tackled the much larger Bedouin war tribes, whereas the more civilised and in many ways smaller family ones, which hugged the coastlines of North Africa, tended to be more civilised and less barbaric in much of their presentation and interpretation of what they were doing. So when the more savage ones and lost their paganism, converted to Islam, they had a massive numerical superiority towards the Byzantians and the more civilised Bebians in that area at the time. In the 6th centuries, the tribes will move left. I've done that. The Byzantines have had, in many cases, converted to Christianity. It suggested that the Muslims assumed their leadership and gave extra momentum to where am I going to start cutting? This book is terrible from scrolling. There were Bebians who lived in the cities, many more lived in farms, did that. According to Arab sources, the Bebian tribes were divided, did that right. The Baharim, by contrast, were older established tribes and who had entered into close relations with the Byzantines and had, in many cases, converted to Christianity. This suggested that the Muslims assumed leadership and gave extra in them to a speculative raid to the west, in which momentum to the tin expedition population, the tiny existence movements of populations among the Bebians, and this goes some way to explain the success of completeness of their conquest. In practice, the difference between Burta and Barian seem to have had little effect on the policies of Andalusia, unlikely the murderous displacements between the Qaza, Murdan and Yemen among the Arabs and divisions among the Bebian tribes were based on smaller units of individual tribes and extended families and their relationship to the Arab groups. The conquest of North Africa had been in the early 22 to 642, were when that's 622 to 6442 is how history people tend to operate. When the conquest of Egypt, Amaresis and Al-Asris, led by the expedition to Baracus and Cyrenius, he dispatched an army to Zuriel, an oasis settlement to the south, led by Ukrel Ilnilthiris. Urukal came from the branch of Quirinius, the Prophet Muhammad's tribe, and his father Nafris had been one of the first Muslims to settle in Egypt. He came from the elite of the early Islamic society, and he used his position to make contacts among the Berber people of the area. Alliances that were to make his family the most powerful in North Africa and Andalusia before the coming of the Umayyads in the mid-8th century. When Amr returned to Egypt, he left Urukari in charge of the Bakris. Basically, members of Muhammad, peace be upon him's tribe, became the social elite of much of North Africa. So this is where you find the Bebians and the elite of Muhammad's tribal people, not Muhammad's family itself, peace be upon him. I'm referring towards the historical tribe that the Muhammad belonged to. They became the future rulers of much of North Africa's territories. This is where many of the North African kings would draw much of their lineage from, as they continue to move down through the centuries and generations. I think the Moroccan king claims lineage from Al-Andalusian royal family itself. The conquest of North Africa was difficult, partly because of the political disputes among Muslims, but mostly because of the vigorous resistance put up by the Berberian tribes and of the interior and the garrisons of the Byzantium cities like Tripoli and Carthage. Now, let's not sugarcoat this. Even at this time period, the Byzantines were on a slow decline, but they were still a major power. They were kicking the shit out of the Bebians on a regular basis, the pagan ones. They were backwards and forwards wars time and time and time again. And at some point, I think as late as the 9th century, the Byzantines managed to recover almost the entire coastline of North Africa at one stage or another. So there is a massive amount of backwards and forwardsing you have to understand that's going on between the Umayyad Caliphate and what is effectively the ageing, sleeping superpower. The Muslims more became a vigorous resistance put up both by the Berberian tribes and the interior of the garrisons of the Byzantines, the Tripoli and Carthage on the coast. More than the other Arab commanders, Uruk seemed to have an understanding that the key to subduing North Africa was to enroll the support of the Berberian tribes. And in 50 to 670, again, 50 is about, we're talking about the 6th century, he founded the Muslim settlements of Qashqas away from the coast in the central plains of Tunisia, like early Arab garrison cities at Kufa and Basra and Fasra. This was designed to be a settlement where the Muslims could preserve their identity and from where they could dominate the surrounding countrysides. In 681, Uruk led a spectacular raid to the west in which he reached the Tangrian and the Atlantic coast. Although there would be no Muslim settlements beyond modern Tunisia at this stage, this was his last and greatest achievement, but his memory lingers on as his sons continue to play the very important role in the Muslim politics of North Africa. Now, this man's sons, they are the direct first major Muslim kings in this time period. They are basically setting up the kingdoms of places like early Morocco. I think Morocco had like 4 or 5 actual micro kingdoms at his time period, and then they consolidated from much of his family. So Yuqabal and much of his conquests are very, very important for the onload that comes into the Andalusian period. The Muslims did not recover the initiative. This was his last greatest achievement with the Muslim policies. They're following the period where the Arabs were almost driven out and Qalassus itself fell to the Bebian leader Koskaru. See, the Bebians resented Arab leadership. Even though at this point they were actually Muslims, they considered them ethnically that they had the right to live these lands, per se. Bebian leader Koskaru, the Muslims did not recover the initial until 74694 when the Caliph Abd al-Malik sent an army of Syrians led by Hassan al-Agirist. He is a descendant of that king I just mentioned earlier. And the priestess Kashuria. Okay, that was a heretic priestess. I didn't know about that. Established himself firmly in Quraysh, where he was able to do this, not only because of his Syrian troops, but because of his policy of working with the Bebians. Some tribes, like the Lutheran, seem to have remained allies of the Arabs throughout. Many others came over after the defeat of Kushla. Yes, the priestess. She was the heretic priestess who engaged black magic. Woo! She was one psychotic bitch as well. From my history understanding of her battles, she used to cut out the hearts of Muslim soldiers, and she was an abject terror. She engaged in terror tactics, and I suspect that's where a lot of the modern day Muslim terrorists draw their inspiration from some of these battles, in how she and the Khazarites then retaliated on the Bedouins, doing exactly the same backwards. Hassan was dismissed by the governor of Egypt, who supervised the western provinces of 704, probably because he was too successful, and was replaced by Musa al-Nasuri, a man of obscure origins who had risen in the financial administration of the Umayyad Empire. He continued Hassan's policies of recruiting and converting Bedouins into Muslims' armies and using them to new forces to extend his control further to the west, until in about 90 to 708 he took Tangrian and appointed a Bebian supporter of his Talqur and Zaret as governor. The conquest of North Africa had been achieved by an alliance of Arab and Berbers in the name of Islam. As the conquest proceeded, so the importance of the Bebian contribution increased. Basically, the Umayyads could no longer ignore the Bebian input, and at this point the Bebian tribals were effectively Islamized. They had almost converted entirely towards Islam, and this is the point where the previous royal family I was mentioning, they would eventually become the royal families of Northerners, which were kind of like a vassal states of the Al-Andalusicans themselves. But this is predating the Andalusians, my point is, the Umayyads themselves. This is where they predate the Umayyads and would then take over the actual rulership of this area. I hope you've enjoyed my first part. This has been about 20 minutes I've been yakkering at you, and maybe get you off my back and promote it online for most of my friends. and I will be doing a part 2 tomorrow for you. Alhamdulillah. I hope you enjoyed.